In this video, we're going to be talking about the anatomy and functions of the brain. So there are three parts to the brain, that being the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. Notice that the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. If we look at this over here, the cerebrum makes up the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, and the temporal lobe. These are four lobes that are located within the cerebrum. You might be wondering when looking at an image of the brain that there are a bunch of folds and creases. What are these? Well, basically the reason why there's folds and creases is to allow the brain to expand. So basically when we're learning, the brain expands more and more. So in order to let that expand, that's why there's folds and creases everywhere. These folds are known as gyri, plural, gyrus is singular, and the creases, these lines, are the sculpi or sculpus, that's singular. In the cerebrum, we're going to start off with the frontal lobe. Notice that this is just one side of the brain. There are actually two sides, but there's the left hemisphere and right hemisphere. Looking at this cap over here, there's a frontal lobe on the right hemisphere here, but then there's a frontal lobe on the left hemisphere. These two join actually, and these make up the hemispheres. So actually these lobes are found on both hemispheres. Okay, so first we're going to start off with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe helps with executive functions such as planning, organizing, problem solving, social skills, helps with personality, etc. Now, in the frontal lobe, there's two parts. These two major parts are the motor cortex and Broca's area. The motor cortex helps interpret and process motor movements and sends them to the muscles. Meanwhile, the Broca's area helps create speech patterns and helps create the complex motions with our mouth and tongue. These basically help us talk. Next is the parietal lobe. This helps process and sensory information. The sensory cortex helps interpret the processed information in the parietal lobe and helps with the reflex decisions. The parietal lobe is also known for spatial reasoning and can also make decisions very fast, hence the reflexes. Next is Wernicke's area. It's kind of similar to the Broca's area where you're making speech patterns, but here we're understanding speech patterns. Next is the occipital lobe. This interprets the visual information. So in the eyes, what happens is that it sends the information to the occipital lobe and back around to the eyes again. So it understands what it's going to do. However, a fun thing about that is that the coordinate thing, it wraps around. So it goes opposite. Instead of going like this, it goes like this. And because of that, the left occipital lobe can see from the right eye, but the right occipital lobe sees from the left eye. Next is the temporal lobe. Notice in the temporal lobe, there's two parts, those being the amygdala and the hippocampus. The hippocampus and amygdala is found in the limbic system, which helps with our emotions. The amygdala controls fear and anxiety and refers to similar situations with these emotions. This way is able to understand what's going on and how to deal with it. The hippocampus turns the short-term memory and stores it as long-term memory. For example, let's say you type in a phone number. In a few seconds, you won't exactly remember it, but using muscle memory, and if you type it multiple times, you will soon be able to memorize it and get it off the top of your head. So that's how I turned it from short-term to long-term. Now that we talked about the limbic system, we're going to actually move on to the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe helps with auditory info, olfactory info, also, which is basically the sense of smell, and helps develop our memory. Also, the temporal lobe helps with a lot of the emotions, so the emotions are practically tied to the memory. So if you're feeling happy, you will often get happy memories, and that's because of the temporal lobe. If you get sad, that means you'll get sad memories, and vice versa. Next is the cerebellum. The cerebellum works with the motor cortex and the sensory cortex to be able to determine how to overcome an obstacle. For example, let's say you're walking on rough terrain. What's happening is the sensory cortex is sensing the rough terrain, and it works with the occipital lobe to see if it's even rough terrain in the first place. And the occipital lobe helps the cerebellum try to process what kind of situation it's dealing with. The motor cortex, where we're walking, it helps the cerebellum walk on rough terrain. The cerebellum communicates with all of these types of lobes to be able to successfully walk on the rough terrain without any problems. Hence, that's how we're able to do that. All of this is kind of the cerebellum, the motor cortex, the sensory cortex, and sometimes the occipital lobe work together and communicate in a part of the brainstem known as the pons area. However, we'll get to that later. Lastly is the spinal cord. It takes and receives info and gives it out to the parts of brain where they're needed. And this information is usually given in from the peripheral nervous system, PNS, and is given to the spinal cord, which is part of the CNS or central nervous system. What I'm wearing right now is a brain hat. The front, the frontal lobe. Then to the sides over here, we get the parietal lobe. Then posterior of that, we get the occipital lobe. And then on the sides over here, it comes the temporal lobe. So you can see there's two frontal lobes that join together to make a humongous frontal lobe. And note that the frontal lobe helps with high thinking, decision making. It helps in regards of personality and executive functions. So there's two of them. And on each hemisphere, it has its own things. The left hemisphere is typically for decision making and more logical reasoning. Meanwhile, for the right hemisphere, it's more of creativity, such as music and art. This is all about the brain. However, there's going to be a part 2.